If someone calls your name from the barn, don't go. Say that out loud to anyone who'll listen. I'm telling you what I learned the hard way. Martha, the woman who lives 3 houses down, told me the same thing with her hands white on the fence post. I laughed then, the laugh you use when you're trying to be larger than the fear in your chest. She walked away without looking back, and the silence she left clung to me like dust. I came back because it had to be done. Paperwork, locks, the final sweep of a life laid out in boxes. The place had been measuring its own loneliness since we buried my uncle, Hank, at a funeral with the expected rhythm of hymns and pitying looks. We followed the rules: church, cemetery, neighbors who kept their distance. But the farmhouse smelled wrong. It smelled of old damp and wood rot and something cloying, like a broken jar of jam left to fester in the dark. I slung my flashlight around my neck and felt the air spitty against my tongue when I breathed. The sky pressed low. The stars had been swallowed by a leaden ceiling that made the shadows feel solid. The barn sits at the end of the lane, its door hanging on one rusty hinge, complaining. The wood was scored with time, nail holes, hoof marks, dark stains that never seemed to wash out. That is where the livestock lived, and where people in town said my uncle's memory still prowled. Hank had been a tough man, hands like packed dirt, a voice that cut. I remember, though, his dry laugh at Christmas and the way his eyes at 70 would still light up at talk of a good harvest. We said goodbye properly, but here, things didn't match the paperwork. At first, they were small, easily explained. My coffee cup not where I left it, the chair by the stove pushed slightly back as if someone had just stood up. Drawers creaked open to reveal papers and photos that felt like they didn't belong to anyone living in that house anymore. An old newspaper clipping with the headline torn, a wallet emptied and propped on the kitchen table. I walked through the rooms with my light cutting swaths across the dust. Each arc found something and then seemed to swallow it again. On the hallway floor, I found prints. Not just boot marks. Between them were wider impressions, heavy and uneven, like a broken cloven hoof pressed into wet earth. I stood very still and listened to my own heart and the distant snap of a branch. Neighbors said little. Martha was blunt. There was no body, she said, dropping the words like a stone into still water. Others looked away when I mentioned the graveside. In the bar, someone muttered they'd seen the butcher's boy sneaking toward the fields one night. A kid on the ridge said he'd seen something with a slick back under the moon. They called me superstitious. Maybe I let myself believe that until I smelled it. Metal and sugar, the stench of old blood and rotting fruit combined. It clung to my clothes and hands. The first night I slept in Hank's old room. The sheets still smelled like him, old tobacco and something faintly sweet. A sound woke me, a rub, a deep, low grunt that cut through sleep like a cold finger. I told myself it was the wind. I sat up, the beam of the flashlight slicing the dark. Nothing. Only the window slat knocking and a shadow that didn't belong to anything I could name. Then, softer than breathing, I heard it. My name. Not loud, more like something trying and almost failing to remember the shape of words. Michael, it rasped. The silence that followed was so thick I gripped the mattress to keep from falling. I told myself I would be rational. Paperwork, keys, a creaky roof, anyone would find 1,000 ordinary explanations for what I was seeing. But the rational list shrank fast, leaving only impressions, the smell that got under my skin, the prints that refused to belong to any single story, the way the house seemed to breathe around me. The second day, I went down to the cellar and found the proof that made the hair on my arms stand up. There were jars on a shelf, rows of them, cloudy with sediment. Something dark floated in each one. Bits of hair, a tiny bone that could have been anything until I squinted and saw the serrated edge of a fingernail. Labels, handwritten in Hank's blocky script, had words I couldn't parse at first. Returns, binding, soil. One jar had a smear of something sticky on the rim. When I licked the residue off the pad of my finger because my brain was misfiring between curiosity and nausea, it tasted of iron and sweet rot. Nearby, a shoebox full of black and white photographs spilled like a confession across the concrete. Hank with men in dark hoods, a circle drawn in mud, a rope coiled like a question. In some pictures, Hank smiled, wide, gleeful, his face muddy and unlined in the flash, eyes fierce and alive. There was a diary, too, shoved into a gap behind a beam. It was Hank's, the penmanship getting shakier near the end. The last entries were a jumble of scrawl in capital letters. Pact kept. They chose him. No body. We sealed it like a promise. Then, beneath the smear of a thumb, a list of names. People from the town I recognized, followed by dates and one word beside each name. Paid. Owed. Taken. My own name stared back at me, written small, the ink darker as if written later, as if whoever held the pen wanted the letters to be noticed. I should have left then. Any sane person would have left. Instead, I followed the sound. It started as a thud, slow, wet, like someone punching a sack of earth. Then came a scrape, a soft tearing that made me taste copper in my mouth. The barn door, which I had propped up with a shovel, was closed when I reached it, though I could have sworn I'd left it open. I pressed my shoulder against the wood, and it gave with a long animal sigh. The smell hit me first, thick, musky, and clotted with blood and manure, and something cloying beneath it that made my stomach convulse. Inside, the light from my flashlight was useless against the dark. Shapes shifted at the edges. The beam found the curve of a shoulder where a shoulder should not be, the blank white of a swollen eye, and then it froze on a face that should not exist. Part human, part boar, it was a crude geometry of flesh and tusk. Its snout twitched. One side of its face was flattened and bristled. The other looked almost like Hank, a crease under the eye, a scar on the cheek, the same off-center mole above the lip. The human eye, Hank's eye, stared at me with the same glint I remembered from my childhood, equal parts mischief and hard temper. The other eye was white and milky, rolling like a coin in mud. It made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Then, impossibly, it rasped my name. Michael, it breathed, and the rasp carried an old hurt I hadn't realized I knew. The voice tore something loose inside me. Memory of a hand on my shoulder, a belt cracking across my back, the small kindnesses that had never made up for the rest. Guilt rushed in with the odor of the barn. I backed away, but the floor gave a slick puddle of something that made my boot stick, and when I pulled free, I saw, nailed to a beam, a scrap of paper. It wasn't a photograph, it was a ledger page. Names. Again, Town Council, Butcher the Reverend, and at the bottom, in a different hand, a single sentence that felt like a blade. Blood is not the only currency. The debt looks for its next. My throat closed. The barn seemed to tilt. I couldn't tell if the animal before me was pleading or planning. Either way, it knew me. It knew my name. And somewhere beneath that knowledge was the idea that this was not the end for Hank, and that the ledger's last line might have been written for me. I thought, foolishly, that if I could get close enough, something human would answer. That a familiar face, even one mashed into bristle and snout, would tilt toward me with recognition and the old stubbornness that had once taught me how to split wood and mend a fence. I was wrong. The thing that was Hank moved with terrible animal grace. Each step was a hulking negotiation with gravity and hunger. But every so often it stopped and let the human part peek through. A blink, a curl of a lip that might have been a smile, a breath that tasted like the whiskey he used to hide in the pantry. I tried to talk to him. I said his name until sound felt useless. I told him about the funeral, about the ledger, about the jars. I told him that I had found his diary, that I had read the list with my name on it. When I said that last thing, his head snapped. For a heartbeat, the barn was only two hearts beating, the animal and mine, and his human eye found mine and held. There was pleading there. There was accusation. There was, beneath both, a fatigue so old it might have been the thing that started this. He lunged like a man and a boar at once. I shoved a pitchfork up between us because I had nothing else. Because in the end, the things that keep you alive are small, stupid gestures. The metal met thick hide. It squealed, a sound like brakes and a scream braided together. Blood warm and coppery spattered my jacket. My hand slipped on something slick, and I realized sickly that the barn floor was not only mud and straw. There were indentations, fresh patches of dark, where the creature had dragged something heavier than itself. A scent rose, and with it memory, the sickly sweet of the jars, the sticky smear at their rims. He tilted his head, struggled. For a second, his face was a map of the two lives, the boy who'd learned to carve a whistle from a twig, and the man who'd sat at kitchen tables and negotiated debts in a voice that wore leather. "Michael," he rasped, and the name tore through me like a confession. I reached toward him, toward the human eye, and my fingers brushed bristle that felt like hair and then like wire. He grabbed my wrist with a force that was almost tender and then not, and the pressure was enough to show me the white window of his other eye, rolling without focus. Something hit the beam with a thump, hard, deliberate. I looked up and saw the ledger nailed there, the page turned so that my name stared back in thick, unreadable ink. Beside it, in a hand not like Hank's, a new word had been written since I was last there. I had not written it. The letters crawled, assigned. Below it a date. Below that, my name with a small note, next. Panic is a dry, bright instrument. It cuts clean. I yanked free, drove the pitchfork down, and ran. He followed, stumbling in a lurching animal rhythm that shuddered into something almost human when he reached the doorway and placed a huge, filthy hand against the threshold as if to stop me and also to judge whether leaving was possible. He grunted, and the sound was exactly like the laugh he used to make when a joke landed wrong. For a second, I thought I could hear the town in that sound. The reverend's hush, the butcher's knives, the neighbor's quiet bargains. Outside, the air hit me like relief and salt. I ran without looking back, boots gluing to mud, breath a ragged animal in my chest. I don't know how long I ran. The porch light in Martha's kitchen winked on as if she had been watching all along. She didn't speak. She only held up a hand and then pointed to the road, any road, but she knew. Everyone knew. That night I slept in my truck, but sleep was a net full of holes. When I closed my eyes, I dreamt of the jars, rows of them spinning under a dim bulb, each with a little thing floating inside that looked like a face when the light hit it. I woke tasting iron and something sweet like overripe fruit. I washed my mouth until my gums bled. In the morning, there was a new scrap of paper on the passenger seat. At first, I thought wind, then prank, then evidence. It was a torn ledger page, the town names along the margin. My hands shook so badly I could hardly read. Under the list, in that same different hand, a sentence. The debt marks the flesh. The debt looks for a voice. Beneath it, written in a hand that could have been anyone's and maybe mine, a single word, remember. My wrist stung. I looked down and saw, as if I had not been paying attention for days, a tiny dark freckle on the inside of my forearm. It wasn't there yesterday. Ordinarily, I would have ignored it, but now it looked like the first bruise of something that could not be rubbed away. I felt foolish, then afraid, then terribly, terribly tired. I keep thinking I can leave. I keep thinking the ledger will burn, the jars will shatter, that a shot in the dark will end it. But in the barn, when the creature said my name, I heard not only the hunger, but a promise. Somewhere in the town, under polite roofs and behind the laughing faces, the pact waits. Tonight the wind is thick and smells faintly of iron. I can hear something moving in the straw. I think of Hank's laugh and the way his human eye found mine, and I understand, with a clarity that tastes like blood, that a debt keeps its word. I hear my name in the dark.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.